Welcome everyone to the Phoenix Report. I am Jack Connor. Now this video is the next installment of a series of what I like to call the fireside pitch. It's a podcast or a video, whatever you want to call it, in which I share with you some creative storytelling ideas that I have for an existing series or franchise. Now, I've done many movie reviews on this channel, but I figured I would challenge myself a little to come up with a story idea of my own. Now, if I was in charge of rebooting, remaking, or writing a sequel to a popular movie or TV series, what would I do? Because after all, it's easy to sit back and be an armchair quarterback and critique a movie or show that already exists, but what kind of story would I tell if I was a screenwriter or if I was someone in charge of making creative decisions? Well, right now, you're about to find out. Today, I want to talk about the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Now, the MCU, the Marvel Cinematic Universe, is one of the highest grossing media franchises of all time, spanning multiple feature length films, television series, short films, digital series, and books, literature, all kinds of things. Now, admittedly, I was more of a DC guy growing up, but I always liked the Marvel characters too. And for the most part, I've really enjoyed the MCU movies. And which, it's amazing that these movies got as big as they were, and, because when all this started out, back in 2008 when the first Iron Man movie came out, Marvel Studios did not yet own the rights to Spider-Man, the X-Men, or the Fantastic Four, who are, some of Marvel's most iconic characters. Now, eventually, Marvel Studios found a way to work out a deal with Sony to integrate Spider Man into the MCU. And in 2019, Disney, which still owns Marvel Studios, of course, bought 20th Century Fox Studios for $71.3 billion. This means that the MCU can finally use characters like the X-Men, Fantastic Four, and Deadpool. And that's not necessarily a bad thing because ever since Avengers Endgame, Marvel's film and TV output, which is also known as Phase 4, has been met with some, let's just say, mixed reception. And, that's putting it mildly. A lot of fans out there, including myself, have felt that the quality of most of the films and TV shows have largely been going downhill. Now, I could speculate as to why that has been the case, but that's another discussion for another time. There are plenty of other YouTubers on there who have all kinds of reasons and theories for that. I'm not going to go into that, at least not on this one. I will say that killing off Iron Man, Tony Stark, played by Robert Downey Jr., played to perfection by Robert Downey Jr., and the retirement of Captain America, Steve Rogers, played by Chris Evans, has left those two characters being taken out of the picture has left a pretty big void in terms of star power within the MCU. You want to make sure you keep some of those A-list characters. Plus Sony still owns the rights to any Spider-Man solo movies, although he is still allowed to show up in other MCU projects. Now, given the events of Spider-Man Far From Home, how Peter Parker's role in the MCU is going to turn out, that remains to be seen. That leaves the character's future with lots of questions. And Universal still owns the rights to any Incredible Hulk solo movies. So Marvel is in desperate need of some of their A-listers. As of this recording, there has not yet been any sort of official announcement of any X-Men projects going forward. Again, this is April of 2023 as I record this, so that could change by the time you hear this. I don't know. We've seen some hints of the X-Men in some recent Marvel projects. In the show Miss Marvel on Disney Plus, they mentioned that the title character, Kamala Khan, may have been born a mutant. Most notably, in Doctor Strange and the Multiverse of Madness, we saw Sir Patrick Stewart reprise the role of Professor X, Charles Xavier, from another universe. And also, there was a recent announcement that Hugh Jackman would once again reprise the role of Wolverine in the upcoming Deadpool 3 movie. However, this doesn't necessarily mean that those actors will stick around for the long term. Marvel is very focused on the multiverse at the moment, so we don't know what the implications of all these cameos are going to be. There has been a lot of talk over the years about how to bring the X Men into the Marvel Cinematic Universe, considering that they have been absent for so long now. And the longer the MCU goes, the harder it will be, I think, to find ways to incorporate the mutants into an already established continuity. What makes this even more difficult is that the X Men is an ensemble. There are so many characters, both the heroes and villains, that have established histories in the comics. Assuming you do want to try and keep it as accurate as to the comics as possible, which I think is usually a pretty good rule of thumb. Now, with all these established histories, it could be difficult to retroactively introduce them into the MCU continuity without some sort of time travel or multiverse shenanigans, some sort of explanation there. Um, However, I have a few ideas about how you could introduce these characters into this world, hopefully without compromising too much of their comic book histories in the process. So, with that in mind, here are some of my ideas regarding how I would bring the X Men into the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Um, let's see. An important part of the X Men mythology is Charles Xavier's computer, Cerebro. Cerebro is Professor X's computer that allows him to extend his psychic reach and connect to pretty much every person's mind on the planet. And as powerful as Charles Xavier is, and as highly advanced and cutting edge as the Cerebro technology is, it stands to reason that Professor X would use technology like this to protect mutant children around the world. Now, keep in mind, this is a character who established a school in his home and took it upon himself to house and educate children that were born with mutant abilities like his, and to keep them safe from any persecution from the outside world. Based on this information, and knowing that Charles Xavier has the means and resources to do so, I think it would make sense to establish that mutants have been around in the MCU this whole time, and that Charles Xavier has been using his wealth, his resources, including Cerebro, to keep the existence of mutants secret from the world at large. And the perfect character to assist Xavier in this enterprise is Eric Lenscher, aka Magneto. Now, in most X Men stories that I'm aware of, Professor X and Magneto were friends and allies before their goals and philosophies diverged. Magneto, who I found out the character's birth name was Max Eisenhart, later went by the alias Magnus before taking on the name Eric Lenscher. Now, historically, Magneto has been depicted as having lived through the Nazi Holocaust during the 1940s. The problem with that is that if we were to set this movie in the present day, in 2023, 2024, whenever it is, that would mean that Eric Lenscher would have to be at least in his late 80s or 90s. Now, I suppose you could come up with some sort of explanation that his mutation slows down the aging process, but as far as I know, that hasn't ever been a component of his powers. I mean, I don't know. Some of you X Men diehards might have to correct me on that if I'm wrong, but I think in this case it would have to make more sense for Eric Lenscher to instead be the son of Holocaust survivors instead. Despite not having been in the concentration camps himself, certainly having a family connection to this horrific event could still shape a lot of his worldview. There's also another very important piece of Magneto's history that must be addressed if he is to be brought into the MCU. In the comics, Magneto is the biological father of Wanda and Pietro Maximoff. Now, obviously, this has not yet been addressed in the MCU. We know that the Maximoff twins had grown up in Sokovia and were raised by Mr. and Mrs. Maximoff, who were later killed in a bombing. From there, we know that the twins had been experimented on by Hydra, and it was implied that the experiments are what gave them their powers. But that doesn't mean that they could not have been adopted by the Maximoffs, nor does it discount the possibility that they were born mutants. However, this might be a moot point as things currently stand in the MCU, because Pietro, Quicksilver, was killed in Avengers Age of Ultron. I mean, almost as soon as he was introduced. And Wanda, Scarlet Witch, she was apparently killed at the end of Doctor Strange and the Multiverse of Madness. Spoilers. We're not sure. I mean, my rule of thumb with that is that unless I see a body, then I don't rule anything out. But it looks like she might have died at the end of that. Still, it would be an interesting aspect of Magneto's character to acknowledge, or at least to connect that thread. Um, Ultimately, the core of any movie introducing the X Men into the MCU would have to be, um, I should say, the core of any movie that's going to do that would have to be the relationship between Charles Xavier, Professor X, and Eric Lencher, Magneto. Theirs would be the most crucial relationship in the story. Now, as with other adaptations, Charles and Eric would start out as being friends and partners, working together to mentor countless mutants from around the world while protecting them from a world that doesn't yet understand them. Now, in the MCU, as far as we are aware, the world is generally not aware of the existence of mutants. Now, it's possible that several governments of the world may be aware of people being born with superpowers. Certainly, organizations like SHIELD or Hydra, which specialize actively in finding people with enhanced abilities, might be aware that there are people out there born with extraordinary abilities. I think ABC also had the Inhumans. I think the Inhumans was a made for TV movie, so I think they might have addressed some of that as well. But at this point, I should say, at some point, Charles and Eric would have to develop the Cerebro technology, possibly with help from Dr. Hank McCoy, aka Beast, in order to locate humans, or I should say, in order to locate mutants that are around the world. Now, at some point, there would have to be an event significant enough to cause a rift between Charles and Eric. Now, I think this would have to be based off of their observations of the world's reactions to other superpowered beings. So let's go through what we know about the history of the MCU so far. Throughout Earth's history, the Eternals have operated, largely undetected from humanity at large. Even in the present day, the majority of the world is not aware of the Eternals' existence. At least not yet. I mean, they could always show up in a sequel or something. Also, as depicted in the show WandaVision, witches have been a thing for hundreds of years. They introduced Agatha Harkness and all witches, but as far as I know, that doesn't seem to be publicly known either. So let's see. For several generations and presumably hundreds of years, the Black Panther mantle has been passed down through the various rulers of Wakanda, which is a country that a majority of the world was not aware of um, until fairly recently, let alone the Black Panthers and their various abilities or activities. Also, speaking of Black Panther, in Black Panther, Black in Black Panther: Wakanda Forever, we got introduced to the underwater kingdom of Talokan, which has existed since the late 1500s. And, the surface world had not been aware of them until the events of Black Panther, Wakanda Forever, as far as we know. Let's keep on moving down the timeline. During World War II, Steve Rogers undergoes the experiments that turn him into Captain America, the first super soldier, unless, of course, you count Johann Schmidt, the Red Skull. Captain America is known worldwide during this time, and he is widely embraced as the world's first superhero and continued to be revered for generations. So, probably wouldn't get a lot of controversy there. From the end of World War II through the 2010s, Hydra brainwashes Bucky Barnes into becoming the Winter Soldier, but his existence is largely a secret during this time. We later found out in the Doctor Strange movies, the sorcerer/wizard community has been a thing for hundreds of years, but has largely been underground and not really known by the public until, I guess, presumably after Doctor Strange gets involved during the events of Infinity War and Endgame. So, during the 1970s and the 80s, SHIELD had worked extensively with Hank Pym and Janet Van Dyne, also known as the original Ant-Man and Wasp. But their adventures had been entirely classified and not known by the public. Let's see. Skipping ahead a little bit, in In 1995, SHIELD first came into contact with a fully powered Carol Danvers, Captain Marvel. And now SHIELD was at that moment SHIELD had become not only aware of people with superpowers, but with alien races such as the Skrulls and the Kree. Now, outside of SHIELD, the rest of the world was not aware of their existence. Skipping ahead a little bit. According to the MCU timeline, Dr. Bruce Banner had first turned into the Hulk at some point in the mid 2000s. Now, it's never made clear as to how widely known the Hulk was to the general public, but by the events of the movie The Incredible Hulk in 2008, the press had become aware of the Hulk's existence during the events at Culver University and later on in Harlem when the Hulk fought the Abomination, Emil Blonsky. That same year, Tony Stark reveals himself to be Iron Man. And then later, Thor makes his first public appearance in 2011 in New Mexico, increasing SHIELD's focus towards extraterrestrial threats. But again, still, it's not clear how much the world at large knows who Thor is and the Asgardians are when he shows up. So, why do I mention all those different events? Because the most significant event of the MCU in terms of the people of Earth finding out about superpowered individuals would have to be the Chitauri invasion of New York City in 2012 during the events of the first Avengers movie. When the Avengers saved New York, that would have been an absolute game changer. The world was now aware of the Avengers, and they were seemingly embraced by the public at large. However, I'm sure there were undoubtedly people who would be afraid of beings with that level of power and would recognize the threat that they could potentially pose. Now, if the Avengers were real, there's no doubt that they would be highly polarizing for many people, and I see no reason why this would not be the case in the MCU. Now, I bring all this up, like I mentioned, because seeing Charles Xavier's and Eric Lyncher's reactions to the Avengers in their initial appearance would be very interesting. Knowing that threats are out there, this would possibly inspire Charles Xavier to train some of his top students, like Cyclops, Jean Grey, Storm, Angel, Beast, Banshee, and others. I can name a ton of other examples. He could probably start training people to use their powers and focus on helping people while still keeping a low profile. Now, Eric, on the other hand, would probably encourage Charles to go more public with the school, the Xavier Institute, and try to recruit more X-Men to their cause. Feeling, Magneto, Eric, he would probably feel like this is the right time for mutants to reveal themselves to the world. And Charles might be a little more hesitant to go public, thinking that it's still too dangerous, especially for the younger students that the Xavier Institute has in its care. I could see this being the start of the rift between Charles and Eric, but it's possible that they could still work together for a few more years after this. So fast forward a few years to 2018, when the events of Avengers Infinity War ends with undoubtedly the most dramatic turn of events in MCU history, when Thanos uses the power of the Infinity Stones to erase half of all life in the universe. Now, assuming that they both survived the blip, this would have to be the breaking point between Professor X and Magneto. Magneto could be furious at Charles for being too overprotective to get involved in the Avengers' efforts against Thanos and his armies. And maybe he could have felt that they could have done more to prevent the blip from happening. Now, the next 5 years, which are 2018 through 2023, have not been too heavily explored in many MCU projects as of yet. Now, during this time, Magneto could split from Xavier and start recruiting any surviving mutants to form his own group, the Brotherhood, gaining more resources and power of his own. Now, after the events of Avengers Endgame in 2023, in the MCU timeline, the victims of the blip are restored. Now, while ultimately this is a good thing, that would certainly introduce a whole new series of logistical issues in terms of how the world could possibly recover from these two catastrophic events. Now, this could greatly affect the psychological state and motivation of Eric Lyncher. For years, he had been afraid of mutants being persecuted by a world that doesn't understand them. Then he sees the creation of a group like the Avengers and is inspired to start the X Men with his best friend, Charles Xavier. However, when Eric perceives Charles as being the one that is keeping the X Men and the mutant community at large from reaching its full potential, he could grow very resentful, and he could look at Charles as being overprotective. Now, during the 5 years of the blip, maybe Eric's feelings that mutants, also known as Homo superior, are superior to regular humans, also known as Homo sapiens. This feeling of superiority could grow, and maybe he could get more prejudiced and more bitter against regular humans. Feeling that mutants are superior, that they are the natural step forward in evolution, and they should be the rightful master race of humanity. Now, when the other half of life is restored following Endgame, Magneto might even grow more resentful of non mutants, feeling that the world is even more in need of his and the Brotherhood's leadership than before. This would bring him into direct conflict with Charles Xavier and the X Men, who simply wish to use their abilities to protect innocent people from those who would do them harm. Now, I personally believe that this would be an excellent scenario with which to introduce the X Men into the MCU, as well as provide some in universe reasons for some of the characters' motivations. As far as casting goes, my initial choices would probably be Bryan Cranston as Professor X and Christoph Waltz as Magneto. Now, I wouldn't necessarily want to use the actors from the Fox X-Men movies, as I feel like that would be a little confusing to the average moviegoer. Even though we saw Patrick Stewart in Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness, keep in mind if we're looking to start fresh and not necessarily rely on the multiverse as the narrative crutch that I personally consider it to be. Not to mention, as much as everyone loves Hugh Jackman as Wolverine and Patrick Stewart as Professor X, these guys can't play that role. They can't play those roles forever. I think that's something we need to keep in mind. That if we want to get another 10 or 20 years out of this, that's going to be tough to do with the same actors as before. I do think that no matter who plays Charles Xavier, I think it would make a little more sense for whoever plays him to be American or to play the character as such. As amazing as Sir Patrick Stewart and James McAvoy were in the role, Charles Xavier has historically been depicted as being American in the comics, as opposed to being an Englishman in the movies. I can't, as far as other X-Men characters, I can't really think of too many actors who could play those roles just yet. But I mean, there are so many of those characters that it would be tough to fan cast that all the way through. I feel like that would have to be a separate video. And you don't necessarily need to include Wolverine in the first MCU X-Men movie, although a post-credits reveal or hint would be a cool way to set that up. Maybe some sort of flashback of Logan fighting alongside Captain America and the Howling Commandos during World War II. That would be pretty cool to see. So there you go, man. That's my idea as far as how I would bring the X-Men to the MCU. What would you guys want to see if and when the X-Men are eventually brought into the MCU? I wonder, what kind of stories could they tell? How do you think the X-Men and mutants would fit into the Marvel Cinematic Universe at large? Could you imagine Professor X interacting with people like Nick Fury? What about Magneto finding out that he had unknowingly fathered the Maximoff twins, who went on to become Avengers? Which of the X-Men would have survived the blip? And more importantly, will any of this be feasible depending on Marvel's current plans for phases 5 and 6 and beyond? I don't know what they're planning. Time will tell if any of their plans, I should say time will tell what their plans are going to be from here. Like I said, as I record this is April of 2023, so by the time you hear or see this, things could be totally different. But in my opinion, I feel like that wouldn't be a bad way to get the X-Men going. Just say that they've been there the whole time, but now they're finally going public. So hope you guys enjoyed that. I always enjoy doing these things. Make sure you follow me on Twitter and Instagram at jackxconnor. You can like me on Facebook at facebook.com/jackconnormusic. You can feel free to check out, I'm a musician, so you can feel free to check out the bands that I play in. Vertebreaker, we're original hard rock band at facebook.com/vertebreakerband. And New Divide, which is a Linkin Park tribute band. It's at facebook.com/New Divide Band. And as always, if you have any questions, comments, or suggestions, make sure you email me at jackconnorpodcast@gmail.com, or you can tweet me with the hashtag Phoenix Report. Wherever you're listening to or watching this, make sure you hit like and subscribe, the notification bell, leave a comment, or leave a nice review. I'll have all my links in the description below, so if you want to check out some more content I've got, I really appreciate you guys sticking around this long. This has been the Phoenix Report. I'm Jack Connor, and I'll talk to you later.